Well, with that said, I'm gonna turn it over to Jack. Jack is right now working as a private consultant, although you've been in the public sector before, Jack, as I understand it. And the reason that I've asked Jack to do our webinar today is I'm really getting very interested in this notion of using social marketing as a tool for doing a much better job than we have so far of getting our target audiences to change their behaviors. And I think that the education outreach that we do is effective for changing levels of awareness and knowledge about water quality issues, about best management practices. But I think the evidence is pretty clear that that alone is not sufficient for really getting the behavior change and therefore the water quality outcomes that we ultimately are wanting to see from our efforts. And I think that there's also some pretty clear evidence that at least in some instances, a social marketing approach can be very effective at getting at behavior change and actually seeing those kinds of outcomes. And so Jack has done some really interesting work and put out a lot of good materials, I think, to help people adopt some of the social marketing techniques. So, Jack, I'm going to turn it over to you. If you want, you can do a little better job of introducing yourself and your background, and then tell us more about how you've seen social marketing work at getting more water quality type behaviors adopted.
Okay, Joe, thank you very much for that introduction. I think as a way of just adding to that a little bit, social marketing is basically the concept of promoting or selling, if you will, behavior change, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But I think it's important to note that social marketing really cut its teeth and has done great work in the field of healthcare and personal safety, generally speaking, and that is they are head and shoulders above some of the other social topics and categories, including the environment and specifically watersheds. There are just a handful of us out in the country that somewhat specialize in environmental and or water-related social marketing. Doug McKenzie Moore up in Nova Scotia with his book Fostering Sustainable Behavior, and Nancy Lee on the opposite northern coast in the Seattle area has done some good work in the environment and water related areas, and then myself and my background. I've worked with the Utah Department of Agriculture and Food for 20 years, and part of that time I was the co-chair of something called the State's EPA Non-Point Source Outreach Task Force or Committee or something like that. Anyway, I just remember it was a longer title than I could remember. But what we did is we helped go out to watersheds throughout the country and help kind of bring this education to people of how to do not just effective outreach for, as Joe mentioned, the idea of increasing knowledge and awareness, but also to try to effect some behavior change. And so that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. One thing I will add, at some point, I'm not sure how Joe's going to do it, but at some point he's going to make a few resources available to you that I made available to him this week. I wrote a guidebook for the Department of Ag and EPA a few years ago called Getting Your Feet Wet with Social Marketing, and a little companion workbook to that. Those will be available in PDF format, and another one from EPA called Community Culture and the Environment. And then there was a video segment I wanted to show at the end today, but we couldn't make the audio part of the video work. So over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to take this 35-minute video and break it up into some segments and put those shorter segments up on YouTube and make those available to Joe so you can have the links to those as well. If I go too fast, or if you don't feel like you've gotten everything you need out of today. I'm hoping that some of those resources will work, and also Joe will make my email address available if anyone has any follow-ups after today's call. They can certainly ask me some questions. I'm always happy to respond. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. I think it's always important to talk for just a minute about personal behavior change, because I want everyone to kind of be able to sort of understand when we're asking other people to make some sort of a change in their life, I want you to kind of think about what you'd have to go through yourself. So since we're not in a classroom and it's not very easy to be very interactive, just kind of think to yourself these questions for a minute. What is your daily routine and why? Are there some things that you do over and over, same way every day? And then, more importantly, have you ever made a personal lifestyle change, like, let's say, an obligatory New Year's resolution to exercise more or eat better or to stop smoking or to spend more time with your kids or to manage your budget better, something along those lines? If so, think to yourself, well, what was it that I changed? Why did I decide to make that change? And what was the tipping point? And by that, I mean, there's always a time when you decide that it's more favorable to make a change than it is to stay with the status quo. And that sometimes that is a big, major event that happens that makes you make that change. Like you go to the doctor and it tells you you're not as healthy as you should be, and so you have to make a change. Or maybe it's just kind of creeps up on you gradually, and finally you say, I just can't keep doing things the way I've done them. I need to make a change. But so there's always a tipping point, whether it's hits you in the face or it creeps up on you gradually. There always is a tipping point. So that brings me to the stages of change model, which some of you may be familiar with. But in this model of what people go through when they make a change, it has 5 separate, distinct components to it. And it starts with something called pre-contemplation. And in the pre-contemplation stage, you may be, just aware on the periphery that a possible change is out there and that something exists that you could do differently. But you're not really seriously thinking about it. When you go to the contemplation stage, then you start to seriously think about whatever it is. Everybody else on my block is using curbside recycling, and I'm not. I wonder, if I should, and you really start to think about it. In preparation, now you make a plan to actually do it, whatever the change may be. And so contemplation, you're thinking seriously about it, but preparation, you're actually saying, okay, well, if I'm going to make this change, here's how I would have to go about doing it. Then you take action, which is, the easiest thing to do really is to take action one time. The hardest thing to do is to come back and do it again over and over again. Anyone that's ever started an exercise program could attest to that. So the maintenance then becomes the most difficult part. And as you can see in the red letters on your screen, relapse is a natural part of this process. You'll start to take on a new behavior, and before it really becomes habit, sometimes you fall away from it and you go back to the old habits. Sometimes that relapse happens after a long time of doing things a certain way. But whatever that may be, when relapse takes place, then you have to go back somewhere on that continuum and start over again. And usually that would be the contemplation stage, or maybe it's just back at the preparation stage. You're going to make a better plan this time for being successful. So then that brings us to the next social science theory, which is diffusion of innovations, which is a book by Everett Rogers, who's a social scientist. And Rogers says, quote, that diffusion is the process by which an innovation is communicated through certain channels over time among members of a social system. And so what he basically is saying is that innovation spread either through we as project sponsors going out and telling people about a new way to do things, a new best management practice to implement, and we can do that through several different communications channels, which we'll talk about later, or it's people telling each other about it, and so it can spread by word of mouth and through a social system. So in this, he has 5 stages, and if you kind of look at those stages, you might say, hey, those look sort of similar to the last slide we showed, and they kind of are. It starts with knowledge, but Roger says, just as Joe mentioned at the introduction, just because somebody knows what to do and even how to do it, it does not mean that they will. In fact, most of the time people don't do something just because they know what and how to do. They need to be persuaded. They need to be shown what's in it for me and why should I. So the persuasion is the next part. And if you've done a good job providing knowledge and persuading people that it's in their best interest, there's something in it for them, then they have now the power shifts to them and they get to make the decision. And if you've done a good job with those first 2 stages, they'll decide to implement what it is you want them to do. They'll implement it once, and then they'll confirm whether it's something that they want to continue. And even if it's something like, fencing off a riparian area or something, yes, they implement it and it's done, but there's maintenance and there's behaviors and habits related to that. So, you still have to sell them on the idea that it's a good thing to use, or they could get around it and the resource wouldn't benefit. So whether it's something that you have to start from scratch every time, like recycling at the curbside every week, or maintaining a project on your farm, it's that confirmation is what helps you decide, yes, this seems to work for me and I want to keep doing it. This is an interesting slide because according to Rogers, what really helps an innovation to spread is that the innovation needs to kind of match up to people's existing values and practices as much as possible. So in other words, if you can imagine in your mind a continuum between what people do now and what we would like them to do, our innovation, our practice, needs to meet them at least halfway or more if possible. And what makes an innovation fit in with people's existing values and practices would be a relative advantage, which gets back to the persuasion. A relative advantage means that there is a greater reason to do it than to not do it. So is that an economic incentive? Is there an economic payoff afterwards? Does it have to do with time and convenience? You're showing them you can save them some time, make their farming practices easier. What are the relative advantages that you can show them that would make them want to do this practice? And then, as I say, you need to, as much as possible, make it be compatible with their existing values. Now, the next one, I'm going to mention again later also, but this is really important. Whatever we ask people to do, it has to be simple and easy to use and easy to do. And certainly when we get involved in installing on farm projects, that sometimes is not so simple, but we help them figure out how to do it. We bring in consultants or practitioners to help them install or whatever that looks like. But it needs to be as easy to use and easy to implement as possible for the end user. You want to be able to test this and measure the results and see that you actually can make a difference. So you want to pick an innovation that is easy to do a pilot with and that's easy to see those results. And I know that anybody that works with EPA or USDA funds knows all about measurable results. So that brings us to marketing. Well, marketing is what's called an integrated communications process, which just simply means that it uses various channels of communicating your message. It aims to create voluntary exchanges. And backing up to various channels, what I mean by that is some of those are very community-based in nature, like knocking on somebody's door and telling them about a program, going to a meeting and showing them a PowerPoint presentation. Some of them are very mass media in nature. You put an advertisement in the newspaper or get a story published in the local paper, an interview on the local radio station, or in larger communities, maybe something on TV or billboards on the interstate or whatever. But so a mixture of those very community-based approaches and the mass media approaches is what integrated communications is. Voluntary exchange is that, you offer something and people voluntarily give you something in return. And in marketing, we use the term called the 4 Ps, which are product, price, place, and promotion. And again, in a classroom setting, I would ask people, so what do we mean by the product? Well, let's use a commercial example for a minute here. If, let's say, Coca-Cola is our example. So a can of Coke might be our product in this case, and the price might be whatever it was priced at. And let's say it's $1.25 in a vending machine. Well, the place becomes that vending machine. And the promotion, certainly they have a big sign that says Coke on the vending machine, and then there's all the other promotions in the world that say Coca-Cola. So that's the promotion. And in social marketing, it's a little bit different, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but because a lot of times that product becomes an action. So think about that for a minute. And then the final part of this is marketing seeks to build relationships. So it's an antiquated concept to think of one and done or hook 'em and cook 'em. You don't want to just sell somebody something and then move on to the next person. Marketing is most of the time now about building relationships. You want repeat customers. You want people to trust you and believe that what you're offering them is of value to them. So social marketing, and I can't take credit for this picture. It's from Nancy Lee up in the Seattle area. Being landlocked, I don't get to see very many great social marketing examples in piers or beaches. But social marketing is the use of marketing principles to influence human behavior in order to achieve specific behavioral goals for social good. And what I like to say is it's selling positive behavior. So I think it's important to kind of think about that we're actually talking about using marketing and advertising types of strategies, but for social good rather than to sell products. All right, well, how is social marketing different? Well, the objective. Social marketing seeks to influence behavior and change social behaviors to benefit the target audience and general society. So if you want to do a watershed project, you need to show the upland or streamside landowner that there's a benefit to him or her, and then hopefully their improvements will improve the water quality or reduce soil erosion or whatever you're seeking to ultimately achieve, and that benefits society in general. Partnerships and the media mix are very important. Now, in my Coca-Cola example in the commercial world, those companies for the most part go it alone. I mean, Coke and Pepsi don't partner very often. There are cross-platform partnerships, so people that don't sell the same product might partner with one another, but typically they make pretty good money. They have access to pretty good money for advertising and marketing budgets, so they're in it alone. In our world, we rely on the partnerships to leverage our funds, to leverage our manpower, to leverage our knowledge base and the skill sets that we have. And so the better your partnerships, the better your programs and your implementation efforts can be. And I'm sure you all know that already. And then this media mix that I mentioned before is really important because we don't have the money for great big advertising, and a lot of you might be working in smaller, more rural areas where being on the big television news or advertising in the Columbus market or the Cleveland market isn't going to necessarily hit your target audience the way you'd like it to. So you need to mix what mass media you have access to, whether it be a local community paper or radio station, with those more community-based approaches, as I mentioned earlier. And then, sometimes you have to kind of work to change values and attitudes. Roger said you need to get your innovation closer to people's existing values and attitudes, but sometimes you need to move the needle on people's values and attitudes just a little bit and help them have a shift, which sometimes happens over time. Some people might start to recycle aluminum cans because they can make a little bit of money, and then they decide, well, it's pretty easy to recycle, and takes the recycling to one can out on the curb and the other stuff to the other can, and so that kind of makes them into more recycling type people and changes their attitudes and behaviors a little bit. And then finally, a call to action is critical. I mentioned that before. Our product oftentimes in social marketing is an action verb. It's recycle, fence off the stream, mow your grass high so you don't have to water as often, those kinds of things. So I have this slide up here, and I hope people can see it okay. It's the social marketing process in 4 phases, and there's a lot to this process, but it's not as daunting as it sometimes seems. But in this process, we start with the issue and the problem. And so what that means is, I say, okay, well, we have a watershed issue. We have erosion taking place, and the problem is cattle trampling stream banks. Okay, well, so what are the actions that can be taken by your audience to help reduce the erosion from trampled stream banks? Now, in another part of your watershed, the erosion issue may be from recreation. And so you have to think, well, how do I separate my audiences and separate the actions that we want people to do? And then we need to look at, there are those behaviors you want people to change. So maybe you fence your cattle off, you only hike on designated trails, those kinds of things. But then there's also structural issues. So what can you do as a project sponsor to, once again, meet your audience halfway or more? We had I'm not going to show this example, but we had an example in Utah several years ago in the East Canyon Creek watershed. Some of you, if anyone's familiar with the state of Utah, might know Park City, Utah. It's about 25, 30 miles from Salt Lake, and it's a mountain community. Most people own dogs, and there are a lot of mountain streamside trails in that community, and most people walk their dogs on the trail. They were having issues with animal waste from dogs getting into the river system. Well, what they found was their social marketing efforts could only go so far because one of the problems was there weren't enough waste cans along the trail. If you start the trail in the parking lot and there's a waste can, but then there's not another one for a couple of miles because you're in high country, alpine, narrow track kind of trails, it's hard to get trash cans in and out of. Well, people didn't want to carry the waste. So what happened was they might have grabbed a trash bag at the trailhead and bagged up the waste and then just left it on the trail side. And then the next time there was a rainstorm or snow melt event, it washed the trash or the little bag, animal waste and all, right into the stream. So they had to figure out, how can we get some additional trash cans on that trail? So that's a structural change that the project sponsors had to make. And they were able to figure something out. But so then you go from the issue to the audience. And in the audience, you define and segment them. You need to understand their knowledge, their attitudes, their practices, and the barriers. What's keeping them from changing? We usually test our approaches. I try to test messages with people, either informally and anecdotally or in more of a formal research setting. It doesn't have to be a formal research setting. You can do it more anecdotally if you want. Then we go to the campaign itself. At this point, you understand your issue and the behavior changes you want people to make, your part of that, what you can do to help them make that change. you understand the audience, you've got some messages or an approach to take to overcome those barriers, and then you implement with your media mix. And I've mentioned this a couple times already. You balance the mass media and the community-based approaches. And then finally, the evaluation. And I think it's just important to kind of mention evaluation, although I think that most people have evaluation components in their grants or their own work plans, and so you may be using your own evaluation techniques, but it's just nice to know that if you're asking the questions along the way, did we do the things that in the process that we needed to do to produce the outputs that we needed? What outcomes were we looking for, and what final impacts were we looking for, and how achievable are they? And one thing I would say about social marketing is you need to make your projects realistic. We all want improved streams, but a lot of times that water quality improvement takes place over years, and after getting a lot of cooperators on a stream system involved. And so you need to be able to say, for this specific project, what is a logical short-term, medium-term, and long-term outcome that I can expect? Just to kind of keep it realistic. Okay, so there's several guiding principles to social marketing. One of them, I've mentioned this before, and I do get to be a little bit redundant and mention things over and over again, and one of the reasons I do this is because they're very important concepts. And so promoting a simple, doable behavior is one of those very important concepts. You see on the picture on the left, there's one-way streets, but if you look at that entire thing, it could look kind of confusing. So as you're promoting a simple, doable behavior for people, step back a little bit, see if you can see the forest for the trees, and determine, is what you're asking people to do in conflict at all with other things that they're being asked to do? Not just their own values coming into it, but is there another agency asking them to do something slightly different than what you're asking them to do? And if so, what can be done to kind of make it easier for people? Because the more you try to see things from the audience's perspective, the easier this whole process will be, including knowing whether your behavior is really simple and doable. So then, of course, the target audience. You want to get people that are involved in your targeted behavior. So if you're looking at farm and ranch-based watershed improvements, you're going to be targeting that farm and ranch community, and maybe some of the people that work with those people, like the implement dealers, the veterinarians, whoever they may be. And then you want to try to find the people who are ready to act. And so in the picture on the right-hand side, if my goal, the behavior I was trying to promote was get the cat, I think I picked the right audience. So pick an audience that's ready to act. Okay. This is more of Roger's stuff here. There's a lot of sources, and I think that many of you are extension educators and you work with the Ohio State University, so you probably have some access to good background data that will help you with your audience. Maybe even with some formative new audience research, you may, Joe or somebody else may have some ways to help you be able to do some of that research at a cost-effective price if you have to. But let's talk for a minute about the bottom part of that slide, social diffusion. According to Rogers, if you see that bell curve, any social group is broken up into several categories, starting with innovators, then early adopters, early majority, late majority, and laggards. The innovators are the smallest percentage there, approximately 2.5%. The early adopters are 13.5%, as you can see, and then you have those two big majorities. Well, what Rogers says is that if an innovation can hit and take hold in somewhere around 10 to 15% of a given small social system or target audience, you have a very good chance of it now being able to spread on its own very effectively, and then the amount of external pressure from you promoting it does not have to be nearly as great. So Rogers likes to say if you target kind of those early adopters, the innovators will come along, and if you can target those early adopters and get many of them involved, now if you've got innovators and early adopters, you're at 16%, then you should be able to really spread. The other thing he says is that most of that last 16%, the laggards, these are people who aren't going to change no matter what you do. It's not necessarily cost-effective to try to target or expect the laggards to change. Sometimes they will, but oftentimes they won't. So something to keep in mind. So I wanted to really quickly go through a watershed story that I've been involved with that started back in about 1990, and it's called the Chalk Creek, Utah project. And Chalk Creek is a small tributary to the Wilbur River, and this is an area that's about 50 miles or so 55 miles from Salt Lake City in northern Utah. And it's kind of mountainous area. And this is a relatively small tributary and small watershed, as you can see. But the thing to kind of keep in mind here is that unlike, I believe, you folks, I live in a public land state. About 70% of the state of Utah is public lands. And so to find a watershed that was 100% privately owned was really important for us as we were piloting this, because other times when we work with landowners and grazing permittees, we also have to work with the Forest Service and BLM. So just being able to work with the one audience of the landowners was really helpful as we were cutting our teeth on this process. So Chalk Creek is an animal agriculture watershed, cattle and sheep both. It suffered from erosion. It has fairly steep stream banks, and there was a lot of grazing. And in 1983, there were historic floods, and those floods really accelerated and exacerbated the erosion issues that were there. And as you can see, back in 1990, it was the third most impaired stream in Utah. Well, what we decided we would do is, me from the state level, I decided the right thing to do was to work with the local NRCS conservationists and the conservation district employees. A lot of times you'll have an extension person that's going to be kind of a lead on this, and in this particular watershed we didn't really have a strong extension person. That person wasn't very interested in the environmental or water quality issues, was more interested in the FFA kinds of part of the job, and so we didn't have that buy-in, but most of the time you would. But so anyway, so get the local people at the most local level. Hopefully they live in that watershed also, along with working there. Those were the people we wanted to get to take this message out to the community. We had an initial meeting with, I believe it might have been a couple of combined canal companies, or it might have been a soil conservation district board meeting, but we invited the public of landowners, and we got a lot of people there. And our local NRCS and district employees suggested that I not be there, and that was a really good idea, because they met with a lot of resistance, being the local people. Imagine what a state person would have, the response he would have gotten. So they didn't want to do that. And one guy who eventually did step up, Gerald Richens, I remember a quote from a video that we shot with him afterwards, and he said, when they first told me about it, I said to myself, those buggers are not going to fence me off my stream. But now, if I had just one thing I could do, I'd pick fencing. So he was a guy who finally decided to do something because he needed the help. He had very highly eroded land, so what was in it for him was the opportunity to maybe save some of his grazing land. He installed one best management practice, a fairly simple one, and then he wanted to do another and another. And what happened is he became a change agent for us. He was an innovator in this project. He was the first one to take on. And then he invited people onto his land for tours, and he went to local meetings, and he talked to people. He got himself elected as the Conservation District Board Chair so that he could promote this agenda that every landowner on this stream should be doing this project. And many of them did follow suit. You can see in the photo above, kind of upper left, that's a piece of Richens land in 1991, and here's the same piece of land in 1998. He had sheep, and so keeping the sheep away from the riparian area was a big deal. After we fenced them off, we provided some off-site watering and a couple of little access points, and then planted willows and other riparian vegetation. It's another project cooperator, and you see the before and after pictures there. And then this next one is the most dramatic, and I'm sorry the photos are small and not the best quality photos, but when you want to know what's in it for me, this guy, if you look at the upper left picture, that stream in 1993 came extremely close to taking out part of his house. So he implemented a stream bank restoration project, and then on the upper right you can see in early 95, and then on the lower left later in 95, and then in 1998 you can see the vegetation filling in. And in this case, because of how eroded the stream was and the elevation in the terrain, and they had to do a lot of hard rock weirs and barbs and those kinds of things. There were a lot of hard structures they put in that stream. Well, you can see they didn't just do riparian stuff. If you look down that list of BMPs they completed, and the important thing then was that a lot of these guys were flood irrigating, so several years later we were able to get additional funding and implement a pressurized sprinkler irrigation system for these guys. They loved it because they could water any time. They didn't have to do it on their traditional turns, and it was good for the watershed. And then I think it was about early 2000 to 2002, they did some additional monitoring in the monitoring cycle in the state, and they had found about a 20%, almost 20% reduction in phosphorus, which was one of the main things they were going after. So they felt like that was a pretty successful project. Okay, so continuing on really quickly, and we're almost done. The guiding principles of social marketing continue then with the audience, and it's important not only to segment your audience and pick who they are, but to get to know what it is they know, what they think, what they do, why, and those barriers to change. Once again, that's a repetitive, but one I wanted to bring up one more time. And as you think about those barriers, they can be several different types. There's monetary, there's time and convenience, lack of knowledge and education, and then there's perception, things like, social norms. Well, nobody else is doing it. And if you can show them that actually there are people doing these behaviors and practices, then that sometimes helps people who want to fit in. They want to identify with a group of people. And as you look at those reasons for the barriers and reasons for change, one thing I would note: if you're working with a more urban suburban audience, that their economic well-being is not tied to the behavior you're trying to do, like for example the curbside recycling in a neighborhood, money is usually one of the least compelling factors for people. If their bottom line is tied to it, like a nursery business, a farm, ranch, etc., money can be a very powerful motivator. Not just cost share, but the ability to save money or make more money later on. Another principle is developing the messages that resonate. As you remember in the process, as you work with your audience and learn about them, you might test some message concepts with them. But your messages want to be simple, and they want to play to those benefits that overcome the barriers. And then, of course, as I've mentioned several times, they need to call people to action. Social marketing is all about doing something. So what is it you're asking people to do? And some ways to make messages effective include sending a collective message. Each of us has a role and a responsibility. You could tie your messages to people's everyday lives. The benefits, once again, cost savings, family, health and security, money. Sometimes it's history and tradition. It's being able to keep the farm profitable, to pass it on to the next generation, or keep the land in agriculture, whatever that may be. You want to make it local. You need to make it as local and real to people as possible. help them understand how is it going to benefit them on their land as well as the overall watershed and the downstream user. You want to make it manageable, again, simple, doable actions, and then focus on solutions. So what will people get? Not their personal benefits only, but also what kind of societal benefits or watershed benefits will we get from these actions? And then choosing the media mix, once again. Mass media reaches more people, but community-based approaches are better for actually changing people's behavior. And so once again, by that I mean the knocking on a person's door, going to a meeting, making a presentation, talking to a couple of guys around the Cracker Barrel, whatever that looks like. You have the and on-farm tours, like we did with Gerald Richens up in Chalk Creek. These are the opportunities to get deeper and really kind of help people to understand how the change would benefit them and the community. But even if you put things like brochures and pamphlets and websites up in the mass media category, you have to start with the knowledge. So sometimes you have to do things just to make people aware of a project or to help them, educate them as to why they should do it. And once you've done that, then and you can do that in the community-based approaches, but sometimes it's more cost-effective to do it through mass media as well. So you'll have to figure out the media mix that works best for you. And social marketing can work on any scale. It can work on 100 farmers and ranchers in Chalk Creek or several million people in a large city. But you just have to pick the mix that's going to work best for your audience. And then finally, just another word about evaluation. The more you document, I think, the better your project will be. Documenting your inputs at the beginning, the process you go through, what products you produce, what outputs, in other words, you do, and then the short-term, medium-term, and long-term outcomes. And in my mind, if you're able to really document these things and show them along, what you're going to sometimes happen is you're going to say, well, I not only showed successes, but I showed some problems we had. And most of the time you learn more from the problems you have and figuring out ways to overcome those problems than you do actually from the successes. So social marketing is not a type of endeavor that works smoothly all the time or is linear in nature. You sometimes have to go back, like I mentioned with relapse in personal change, you sometimes have to go back somewhere in the process and reframe it and start over or start part way over. But if you do these basic ideas of clearly defining your issue and the behaviors you want people to change, understand your audience, including figuring out their barriers to benefit and their benefits and the messages that will help them overcome the barriers, you implement using a good mix of channels, and you evaluate it, you can be very successful. I've done projects all over the country, in urban Washington, D.C., in the Gulf of Mexico, in very rural watersheds in Pennsylvania, in Utah, both in rural and urban watersheds, and we've had really good success. But it does, if you follow the process, you can be very successful. And I will say, finally, a lot of this you can do yourself. Some of it you may choose to have hired out or bring in some people in your partnerships who have some other skills that you don't have, like working with the news media or doing advertising or conducting surveys or whatever. But a lot of this can be done. You just have to have the right project leaders that have the motivation and want to do this type of approach. So, Joe, with that, I think I'll turn it over to questions you have or anybody else might have.
Okay. We did get one question about the PowerPoint, if you would be willing to make your PowerPoint available to other folks who would like to present this to their some of their partners.
Absolutely. Brian received my PowerPoint via email and loaded it up, Joe, so I'm sure that he can make it available to you, or I could email it to you after we're done. And I'm happy to have you make it available to everybody.
Okay, and just so everyone knows, we're also recording this webinar, and we'll also be posting that on the Ohio Watershed Network website. A question that I have, Jack, is that when one of the challenges with a social marketing versus, say, a commercial marketing situation is that you're often trying to sell a product specifically to the individuals who might be least interested, because let's say in an agricultural watershed, it's often the folks who don't show up to seminars and field days and things like that, whose farms are perhaps causing the most problems. Mm-hmm. And so one of the challenges that conservation professionals have, watershed professionals have, is how do I get to that guy who's the hardest nut to crack?
Right.
And what tools does social marketing provide me that will allow me to be more effective with maybe the folks who tend to fall into the laggard category? How do we get to them?
Well, I think there's two things I would say to that, and number one is you need to start with this idea of barriers and benefits. As much as possible, you need to kind of get a feeling for why is it these guys aren't taking part, and what is it we can do to entice them to take part in our program. And I know that, like from the Chalk Creek program, some of these guys were losing really valuable acreage, but they really didn't want to participate because it was a government-sponsored cost-share program, and they did not want the government on their property in any way, shape, or form. And so one of the things that we did to try to overcome that, again, as I mentioned, is most of these guys didn't see me or even know who I was until later on. After they'd already signed up to do work, I did go out and we made a video and interviewed them for some other things, but they didn't really realize that I was sort of helping out behind the scenes, kind of engineering this program. It was very, very local people doing it. Now, beyond that, though, if you can find some of the actual landowners, so yes, maybe you have an extension or NRCS or Conservation District employee who they live in the watershed, they might go to church with some of these guys, and that's a good source. But maybe that doesn't do it all the time. And so then the next source is to find a Gerald Richens, like we had in Chalk Creek, somebody who is taking on the best management practices, who then might be a change agent. Now, Richens did it on his own, but some guys and women are willing to be asked to kind of take on that role as change agent. But so in other words, it was one of their neighboring farmers who had done the project who was then the one that was promoting it. And in some respects, from what I understand, he wasn't just, saying, hey, this was a good idea. He was pestering guys and really bugging them and going over to their farm and trying to get him to come in and come back with him in his truck to his farm. And so he went over and above, the call of duty there, just because he became, he was convinced, he was sold, he got converted. But I think oftentimes, even if it's the most local agency and the most innocuous agency like Extension or NRCS, I think if you can go one step further and find a change agent within your watershed, that'll make a big difference. If you can find a guy who's actually there working the land, a neighbor on the Conservation District Board or the Farm Bureau Board or something like that, somebody who some of these guys might respect, then that becomes a whole different deal.
We had a question, actually a couple of questions from Elaine Mobius, and I'm gonna start with the first one. She asked, how involved do you get with local officials versus landowners? And so I guess her question is, to what extent does social marketing work with maybe that the people who work with the target audience, or to what extent are you working to directly impact the people whose behaviors you're trying to change?
Sometimes those structural changes that I mentioned, being able to make things easier for your end user audience to make a change, sometimes that requires working with an entirely different audience. So maybe your first audience you're working with are going to be local elected officials or some other agencies to try to get them to pony up some money or to relax some standards or to do something that will make it so that you can promote a benefit to that end user agriculturalist that will make him or her want to take part in this project. So I guess what I'm saying is there's different types of audiences. Audiences are come in all different shapes and sizes, and one of your audiences might be that local official or state agency or whatever, to try to help them to understand what they can do to help be part of the overall end user solution. And I don't know if that answered the question. In your mind, does that address what she asked?
Well, I think so. Unfortunately, because we can't unmute individuals,
right.
Ask Elaine to clarify, but I
see the second question, from her, which is how does this work with local politics, which is also sort of related, I think, and that is that you may have to get a county council or a city council to make some or commission to make some sort of changes or allowances or provide some funding or something, and so you might have to market to those people and help them understand what's in it for them as elected officials or representing a city or community before you market to your end users. And I know that I'm working on a project in the Gulf of Mexico right now that's a sea level rise project, and our first audience is going to be those local communities to help them get their hazard mitigation plans in place and actually implement some strategies that they can do themselves. And then there will be some things for the local residents in those coastal communities to do later. But our first audience is going to be those local cities and towns. So this is something that can work on any level. When how it works. Let's see. What was the last thing that Elaine wrote? I don't understand that.
I think she's saying that the way that I phrased the question or my interpretation of it, I think was what she was trying to get at.
Okay, yeah. Local officials first. Yeah, so that's a very valid approach. They become something of a barrier sometimes to the end users doing something, so to eliminate that barrier, maybe you use social marketing on that audience first.
Yeah. So it seems like as one of the strategic questions that you need to ask yourself as the change agent, as you're identifying your target audience, is the best use of my resources going to be to go after the person who's actually going to make the behavior change, or perhaps there are some other folks who have influence on those people who I need to adopt the behavior, and it might actually be more cost-effective for me to focus on those folks and get them to, the behavior change in them would then be how do they work with their target audience or with the landowners and getting them to change their behavior. So you can look at working with different levels, different layers of influence in the system, in the human social system, and maybe your target audience is not the ultimate, person who's making the land use decisions. Maybe it's someone who has influence over those people. So that's one of those strategic questions that you need to ask yourself is, what's going to be the best use of my resources? Who can I have the most influence over to ultimately get to the desired behavior change?
Well said, I think. Yeah.
Well, we're out of time, Jack, and I think you did a great job of both giving us the overall picture of what's this whole social marketing thing, but also putting it into some specific examples so that folks can see in some way the power and how social marketing is different than maybe just the business as usual education awareness approach. So there's a lot more to delve into, but unfortunately we don't have time today. But you have provided us with some great additional resources that people can dig into and learn more about this. We'll be posting those with the recording of this webinar. So we are going to be posting the recording of this webinar in the next few days. And along with that, we'll have some of those resources available to you. And I guess the last thing I want to say is that we do have an evaluation online. Brian has posted the link to the evaluation down in the chat. You may have to scroll up to find that link, but it is in the chat, and there Brian's just posted it again. We always really appreciate feedback on our webinars, and this is a really quick, believe me, it's a very quick feedback mechanism, so you don't need to worry about spending a lot of time on it. So any last comments from you, Jack? Thanks very much for the presentation.
Thank you. I had a great time. Thank you very much. Yeah, if anyone, like I said, we'll have my email address available too if anyone wants to follow up at all. I'm happy to do that.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for being on. I apologize for the slightly late start, but I think Jack made it up for it with a great presentation. So thanks everyone, and we'll be posting those additional resources in the next few days.